Strategy games played with pieces on a board can be traced from the ancient Chinese game of Go through the Italian game of chess and onto the King's game in Germany. As these strategy games became more complex simulations of military operations, they became known as war games and were played on tables and floors, starting with Kriegspiel in Prussia. In 1911, noted author H.G. Wells published Floor Games in England, introducing these war games to the general public. The complexity of these games would continue, requiring a referee and simulation of battles on a 4-foot by 8-foot sand table. In the 1958 publication of the game Gettysburg from Avalon Hill caught the attention of Lake Geneva, Wisconsin wargamer Gary Gygax. And in 1967, Gygax co-founded an organization called the International Federation of Wargamers, the IFW, an umbrella for wargaming clubs, and his own special interest group within called the Castle and Crusade Society, which focused on medieval battles. That same year in Minneapolis, Minnesota, there was an IFW faction called the Midwest Military Simulation Association, the MMSA, wherein member Dave Wesley created a wargaming scenario set in the fictional German town called Braunstein. This is where, along with the traditional 2 players commanding opposing armies and a referee, now the crowd of spectators that normally just watch the game were each assigned roles of the various civilians in town, like the mayor and the blacksmith and the innkeeper. And for the first time, the game would now be played with polyhedral dice. These Braunsteins were a big hit amongst the MMSA players, and they started to create their own versions, set in the Wild West and South Africa and so on. In 1968, Gary Gygax created Gen Con, an annual gathering of gamers at a Lake Geneva convention hall hosted by the IFW. And it was at the second convention in 1969 that Gary would meet fellow IFW member Dave Arneson, who was the founder of that Minneapolis gaming group, the MMSA. Dave Arneson took over refereeing the Braunsteins when Dave Wesley was drafted into the Army, and in 1971 created a series of adventure scenarios set in the dungeons and sewer system beneath his fictional Castle Blackmore. Also in 1971, Gygax published his personal wargaming rule set called Chainmail, which included a fantasy supplement consisting of Tolkien-inspired elements. Arneson would incorporate those fantasy rules into his first Blackmore Underground game session, and he would have his players keep their characters for continued use in a never-ending series of Blackmore campaign sessions, increasing in power until killed or retired. A player in that game, named Dave McGarry, devised a board game based on those sessions that allowed players to not need a referee, and he called that game Dungeon. In 1972, they brought Dungeon to Gygax in hopes of it being published, but he was more interested in playing a session of Blackmore, after which he created his own gaming campaign setting called Greyhawk. And throughout the following year, Gygax and Arneson would work together to create a large manuscript codifying their new rule system under the working title The Fantasy Game, which they play-tested in their respective Blackmore and Greyhawk gaming sessions. And Gygax would publish the fantasy game in 1974 as the newly dubbed Dungeons and Dragons through his company Tactical Studies Rules, or TSR. And TSR would publish Dave McGarry's Dungeon board game in 1975. My first exposure to the realms of Dungeons and Dragons was in 1981 when my brother and I got the newly revised and expanded Dungeon War Game. This particular copy of that game was Dave Arneson's personal play copy, signed and given to him by Dave McGarry. The game comes with lots of treasure and monster cards. Now, I had one conversation with Gary Gygax online before he died. It was about how I noticed that all of the monsters that were in the fantasy supplement of his Chainmail publication were carried over into the new Dungeons and Dragons game, except one, the Purple Dragon. Purple Dragon did not get ported over, but a new monster was created called the Purple Worm. Now I know worm spelled with a Y is kind of another name for like a wingless dragon, and this was a worm spelled with an O, which is wingless. Anyways, I just asked him about this, and he clarified for me that he changed the Purple Dragon into the Purple Worm. It was the same monster, but it's now in a new form, so that's why there was no Purple Dragon. It became the Purple Worm. So I was able to get the original artwork for the Purple Worm that was made for the monster card for the Dungeon board game, and I put them together in this frame. It was also during that year that I would see an older kid named Steve drawing a maze on a sheet of graph paper, and sitting on the couch next to him was this box, and it was opened up with all of these really weird looking dice, these books with monsters and dudes with swords and shields and spears. Lots of cool adventure to be had. I said, Steve, what are you doing? And he said, with a scoff, playing Dungeons and Dragons. He scooped all this stuff up, went into his room, slammed the door. Well, older boys don't like dealing with, little nerds like me. So that was it. And I couldn't figure out how he was playing anything, but it sure looked more intriguing than Monopoly or Go Fish. I mean, this was the year that I was really gaining an interest in drawing mythological fantasies because of the release of the new movie Clash of the Titans. Well, it wouldn't be until the following year in 1982 when my friend Dave Selvar would teach me how to play Dungeons & Dragons, as he would wing impromptu gaming sessions for me on the school bus, which was really just glorified storytelling sessions. For example, on my third adventure, I killed Thor, married his wife, and became the new king of Asgard. And I also started wearing this shirt for Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, which I now keep in this frame. Well, finally in 1983, my friend Mike Block taught me how to play the game for real, and my brother got this basic boxed set for Christmas that year. Now, this cover was painted by artist Larry Elmore. He had been hired by TSR in 1982 to paint the covers to all of these Endless Quest books. This one was mine, and this one was my brother's, and then onto the covers of all of these box sets. I met Mr. Elmore a few times over the years, getting lots of these signed prints that I have up on the wall, lots of book collections of all his artwork, and I even got this paintbrush of his that he signed for me. As we started gaming regularly with Mike and his friends, who were all 3 years older than me, I began to notice that the duffel bags they carried were full of all of these books and boxes for the game that looked very different from the books and boxes that were available on store shelves at that time. This is what the game looked like in a time that predated me. And the stories of the adventures that they had been on was like listening to older brothers that had come home from a grand war that I was too young to be a part of and missed out on. Well, I looked up to these guys, and the duffel bags they carried were full of all of these unattainable magical tomes, out of reach and beyond a few rare glimpses, out of sight. All of the books available for me to buy at that time had these great covers painted by artist Jeff Easley. In fact, when I met Mr. Easley, I had him sign a print of my favorite of his covers. This is for the book Legends and Lore. And this is a remake of an earlier book called Deities and Demigods. Now, that is the book with the gaming statistics for all of the mythological gods like Thor. And in that book's earliest incarnation, it had several pantheons that had been removed from the game by the time I came along, such as the gods of Cthulhu from the author H.P. Lovecraft, and all of the gods and characters in the Elric of Melniboné books from author Michael Moorcock. Back then in the 80s, my friend Mike bought me a complete 6-book set of those Elric books, which I've read many times, and then continued to collect every Elric book that came out since then, as well as a complete set of all of the comic book adaptations. That's when I found an original copy of what the first Elric book looked like when it came out in the 1960s. And boy, I loved this cover so much that when I met artist Michael Whelan, I got him to sign a print of it for me. The first time I made a concerted effort to practice drawing was when I borrowed this book from Mike and started to copy all of the Elric characters inside by artist Jeff Dee. Now, this particular copy of Deities and Demigods was Gary Gygax's son, Gary Gygax Jr.'s personal play copy, signed to him by both of its authors, James Ward and Rob Kuntz. Now, Rob Kuntz also met Gygax and Arneson at that second Gen Con in 1969 and would become Gygax's gaming referee or dungeon master during the playtesting phase of the fantasy game, the game that came out as Dungeons and Dragons. And Gary Gygax wrote a several-page article in this May 1974 issue about that first adventure in Kuntz's campaign with his characters Bigby and Mordenkainen. Now, this is Rob Kuntz's personal copy of that issue. Now, I also have a contributor's complimentary copy of the previous month's issue because it's from the month I was born, April of 1974. And these are Gary Gygax's personal polyhedral gaming dice. And this is the first novel he wrote. It's set in his campaign world of Greyhawk, and he signed it. In 1971, a Lake Geneva high school student named Mike Monard started playing in Gary's chainmail gaming sessions and continued the following year in the new Greyhawk campaign. But then he went off to Minneapolis to go to college, where he joined Dave Arneson's Blackmore campaign. So he's the only player to have traveled through all of the formative versions of the game that would become Dungeons and Dragons. And when that game was published the following year in 1974, the first advertisement for all of TSR's gaming products was published in this June issue of Wargamers Digest, and this is Mike Monard's personal complimentary copy of that issue. Later, Monard would introduce Professor Phil Barker to Dungeons & Dragons and Gary Gygax, which would lead to Barker creating the world's second role-playing game, Empire of the Petal Throne, which Gary would publish through TSR in 1975. Now, needing an artist to illustrate the manuscript, Monard introduced them to his roommate, Dave Sutherland, who would go on to become the lead artist and art director of TSR, staying with the company for the next 25 years, all starting with this book, Legions of the Petal Throne. And this was Dave Sutherland's personal copy of that book. During my years of gaming, my most favorite adventure I ever went on was this 1985 module, Earthshaker, by author David Zeb Cook. And this was Cook's personal play copy of that adventure. It's full of his penciled-in notes and player handouts. And our whole group, of course, loved the famous adventure Ravenloft. I eventually got my copy signed by its author, Tracy Hickman. Fast forward to 1995. I was a 21-year-old father and feeling quite nostalgic for those old gaming days with friends that were now gone. I collected a full set of those books in boxes and noticed that the artwork on them was more intriguing than I had imagined. The painting on the cover of the second box set was looking in to the cover of the first box set. And all of those hardcover books had a single painting that wrapped around from the front to the back cover. And the edges of those paintings were all cropped to fit the dimensions of the book, as well as covered up in places, making it not easy to see what the original complete piece of artwork might have looked like. Maybe something like this. And they depicted things that took place in the adventures of the game's creators that were not available to the general public. Places like the fabled city of Brass floating above the elemental plane of fire. I wanted to see these paintings. I wanted to learn all the details about these places. But the word was that all of the original artwork had been thrown out long ago. All of this magical stuff would remain unattainable forever. So I proceeded to paint my own. A few years later, I would scan these into my computer and upload them to a few online forums where I would show them to members of the worldwide Dungeons & Dragons collecting community. And they were pretty happy to see what I thought the originals might have possibly looked like. And over the past few decades, my paintings have been written about in several articles that were seen by millions of people. But unfortunately, sometimes they've become mistakenly represented as the originals. And I have even been incorrectly called the most influential Dungeons & Dragons artist of the 1980s on Will Wheaton's personal blog. Well, it turns out the original paintings were not thrown away. They're all held in private collections around the world, and images of all of them finally surfaced when the company that now owns Dungeons & Dragons published them all in this gigantic art book in 2018. If you would like to learn more about the history of Dungeons & Dragons and its artwork, you should check out books like Playing at the World, Of Dice and Men, Rise of the Dungeon Master, 30 Years of Adventure, 40 Years of Gen Con, The Art of Dragon Magazine, the Art and Arcana book, as well as documentaries like Eye of the Beholder and the upcoming Secrets of Blackmoor and The Dreams in Gary's Basement. But the reason why I'm telling this story is because of things in the game referred to as artifacts and relics, physical objects of myth and legend, like the things that Indiana Jones would seek out on his adventures, the Ark of the Covenant or the Holy Grail, objects seemingly forever out of reach, yet containing untold secrets and power. This comic book is called Knights of the Dinner Table. It's a comedic telling of a group of role-playing gamers, and they have a character based on Gary Gygax. Now, when that character died, players the world over made the pilgrimage to his open casket funeral so that they could discreetly rub their 20-sided dice on his body to infuse them with luck. You see ideas like this presented all over fiction, like the Jack Black film The Pick of Destiny, where the guitar pick of Satan imbues him with the power to become a rock legend, or the Infinity Stones in the Marvel movies, or the Dragon Balls in Dragon Ball, and so on. And this seeming sense of importance is placed on objects in the real world as well. I was listening to a recent interview with Paul McCartney where he was telling the story about how he had gone to a museum with his daughter, and as they were looking around at all of the interesting items they had behind glass cases, they stumbled across an original sheet of lyrics that he had written many decades earlier for one of his famous Beatles songs. Now, he thought back to where this piece of paper could have come from, and he remembered that as he was creating the song in the studio, he jotted down the lyrics on a scrap sheet of paper and just continued to work on the song and work on it, eventually recording it and it going out onto an album. That scrap of paper was left behind with the rest of the trash to be thrown out. Well, he had determined that they frequently had journalists and various people around the studio, and one of these journalists had scooped up some of these scraps of paper and kept it with him, and eventually made it from that journalist into this museum. Now, I'm sure you can see how this paper scrap would be completely devoid of value to the person that wrote the words on it, because the real value is in the song he was creating, not just this temporary piece of garbage. But I'm sure you can also see the point of view of the other person that would place a lot of value on this object associated with something from a person of a lot of importance and a creation they made that the world loves. So we seek out and obtain and put into archives or out on display many physical objects of seeming importance. And some of these objects seem a lot more important to a lot more people than some others. In fact, some of these objects have been coveted enough to go to war over. In fact, sometimes we feel that some of these objects may even contain like a magical power, like giving you good luck. I myself have collected these artifacts and relics of Dungeons & Dragons that I've just shown you. Well, I actually have an artifact relating to Paul McCartney himself. The Beatles got their start in a nightclub in Liverpool, England called the Cavern Club. John Lennon first performed there on August 7th, 1957 with his band, the Quarrymen. And Paul McCartney joined them with his first performance there on January 24th, 1958. Ringo Starr performed there for the first time on May 25th, 1958 with his band, Rory Storm and the Hurricanes, and George Harrison had his first performance with the Beatles there on February 9th, 1961. Brian Epstein saw them perform there on November 9th, 1961 and became their manager. And Pete Best, their original drummer, had his last performance with them there on August 15th, 1962 and was fired the next day. Ringo had his first performance with them as the Beatles on August 22nd, 1962, debuting the band that would change the world. And they would play there almost 300 times through August 3rd, 1963, and exactly 50 years later, I would obtain this brick from the wall of that now demolished original Cavern Club. But if I hold it, will I be infused with the power to play a musical instrument or write a hit song? How about this brick? I pulled this right from the wall of the Colosseum in Rome in 1988, the place where my ancestors fought in gladiatorial combat, the place where Bruce Lee fought Chuck Norris to the death. If I hold this, will it imbue me with the powers of the martial arts? Okay, but how about this piece of cloth? In the 1950s, actor George Reeves portrayed Superman on TV, and he supposedly burned his costumes at the end of each season, though a few still survive in the Smithsonian. Well, the leftover roll of fabric used to create his final cape was cut into 1,000 pieces and sold to fans. On a trip to Chicago, I was able to obtain the number 1 piece. Number 1 of 1,000. Is it bulletproof? Will it help me fly? A young Mark Hamill was inspired to become an actor by watching George Reeves play Superman on TV, and he grew up to eventually portray Luke Skywalker in Star Wars on his home planet of Tatooine. I went to the theater in 1977 to see Star Wars, and that's where I watched the droids R2-D2 and C-3PO land on this sand dune on the planet of Tatooine. This container holds sand from that actual sand dune where it was filmed in Tunisia, Africa. Lost on this desert planet that in my young mind was a real place, C-3PO walks in front of these skeletal remains while yelling out for help to a glint of light on the horizon. Now this is an actual piece of that skeleton. It's made out of fiberglass and was originally created as a prop brontosaurus skeleton for the 1975 Disney film One of Our Dinosaurs is Missing, and then later strewn across the sand dunes of Tunisia, Africa for the filming of Star Wars in 1976. And that's where it remained, until archaeology student David West Reynolds tracked down the original filming locations 19 years later in 1995, the same year I started painting my versions of those original Dungeons & Dragons book covers. And I read about it that year in this issue of the Star Wars Fan Club magazine. I vowed then that I too would one day follow in his path and visit those locations myself. And just like him, it took me 19 years to make that trip. And a few years later, I was able to see Mr. Reynolds' original trip when I helped back his Kickstarter project for all of his VHS tapes and maps from 1995. Here they are on this DVD that he signed for me. In fact, after he found those locations, he was hired by Lucasfilm to bring the crew out there so that they could film all of the new Tatooine scenes for the prequel films. Now, this is an actual piece of the moon, and this is an actual piece of the planet Mars, but this here is an actual piece of the planet Tatooine. No, it's not a real planet, but George Lucas named Tatooine after an actual town in Africa called Tatooine, slightly different spelling, and this is a piece of a meteorite that was found there. But if there was a real planet Tatooine, maybe I could travel there with these screen-used dilithium crystals from the 1960s television series Star Trek. These are the fictional crystals that powered the warp drive engines and allowed the Starship Enterprise to travel to other planets. Engines that are manned by the ship's engineer, Scotty, played by actor James Doohan. And I got these crystals directly from his son, Chris Doohan, who also plays Scotty on the web series Star Trek Continues. All of these items that I've shown throughout this series bring me back to times in my life that I've tried to illustrate for you through my stories. And even these extremely rare items like the artifacts and relics seem to be so important to me. But there's no power in any of these items, no magic, no mysteries. Of course there isn't. And even mundane items like toys and games, well, they have no meaning either. Seeking them out was my way of trying to recapture the times I spent with people. It's the people that matter, not the things. But the people are gone, the places are gone, the times are gone. And owning these objects doesn't change that. But no matter how much you appreciate the time you spend with people while they're in your lives, that time passes away just as fast. And along with it, but the future always holds something new. So thank you for coming along on this ride, and I'll see you again soon.